Tomatoes are an acidic vegetable or fruit. Knowledge is to know that tomatoes are both a fruit and a vegetable. Wisdom is to know never to put tomatoes in a fruit salad. According to my husband, it depends on if you salt them or put sugar on them. Tomatoes are a vegetable if you salt them and a fruit if you sugar them. Hi, my name is Lois Swenson. When I was a kid, my mother canned 100 to 120 quarts of stewed tomatoes every year from our garden. Years later, now as an adult, I can my own tomatoes. This is how I proceed. I start with fresh tomatoes. I usually leave an inch or two of the stem on the tomatoes when I pick them. In Alaska, most of the tomatoes are still green when we pick them because tomatoes ripen in the dark. And in Alaska, it's not dark in the summertime, and by the end of August or early September, the first frost comes. So I harvest tomatoes before they freeze. They're still green. I pick them and bring them in the house and let them ripen inside. Tomatoes ripen at different rates of speed, so wait until you have enough to make a batch. Sterilize the jars you will be using for canning. Use clean jars. Place in a stock pot with about an inch of water. Bring to a boil and then reduce heat to simmer and cook for 20 minutes. Wash or rinse tomatoes and remove the stems. Check for bad or rotten spots. Cut away any spoiled sections. Remove the sterilized jars. Be careful. The jars will be hot. Use a pot holder or towel. Place hot jars on a cutting board to avoid damaging your counter or table. To soften skins of the tomato for easy peeling, place rinsed tomatoes in a stock pot with an inch or two of water. Bring the water to an easy boil. As the tomatoes heat, the skins will soften and split. Using a spoon, a slotted spoon is preferred. Remove tomatoes from the hot water. Place the tomatoes in a strainer with a container underneath it to catch the juices. Touch the tomatoes in the pot. Use the spoon to test the toughness or softness of the skin. Lightly tap or touch. The softened tomatoes will be hot. Tomatoes usually have a dark spot or blemish on the bottom. This is from the original tomato flower. Peel away the skin. Cut away the stem or core of the tomato and any blemishes. Throw these away. Put the skinned tomato flesh in a stock pot. You can use a knife to pierce the skin and then peel away to skin and cut the flesh from the core stem. Save as much of the flesh of the tomato for stewing. You can either cut the tomato chunks into smaller pieces, or as my family does, squish them through your fingers. We came along this method when my sister was about 10 years old. It was around Halloween time, and the joke was to put your hand in things unknown and touch them. So in went her hands, and the next thing my mom and I knew, it was an easy way to squish or squeeze the tomatoes for an even consistency. I have squished tomatoes this way ever since. Getting the tomatoes smaller helps the canning process. Be careful when squeezing ripe tomatoes. They squirt, and they can cause a mess on you and your surroundings. Squeeze until you have a good consistency. Next, on high heat, cook the tomatoes. Make sure you stir often so the tomatoes don't burn or stick to the bottom of the pot. Make sure you have at least 2 inches of space from the top of the pot for expansion. If needed, add some water to the tomatoes for an even consistency. Bring the tomatoes to a rapid boil. The stewing tomatoes will foam. Cook until the foam decreases. This may take several minutes depending on the type and ripeness of the tomatoes. Stir constantly to avoid boiling over. You can see how the tomatoes have boiled down. They are not adding more foam. They are ready to be put in jars. You want your jars warm before you add the boiling tomatoes to them. This prevents breakage of the jars. Having hot boiling stewed tomatoes explode on you is no fun. Been there, done that. I don't recommend it. To warm up your previously sterilized jars, I put them in the oven and heat them to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. The oven is also a good place to store the jars temporarily while canning. Using a wide mouth funnel and a ladle, pour your stewed tomatoes into the jars. Be careful and avoid splattering. I keep the pot of tomatoes on the burner on low to keep them hot. Fill the jars to 1/2 to 1/4 inch of the top of the jar. Only do a couple of jars at a time to keep them hot. They will seal better. In a different pot, boil water with lids and rings to sterilize and soften the lid sealer. Wipe the rim of the jar for a clean seal. Place the lid on the jar. Add ring and tighten ring on the jar. Remember, the jar and lids will be hot. Repeat the process until all the tomatoes are canned. Place on a cutting board or cooling rack. Let the tomatoes cool to room temperature for 24 hours. Then store in a cool, dry place for use for the coming year. The stewed tomatoes are ready for use in whatever good food recipe you want to prepare. Enjoy the fruits or vegetables of your labor. It's great to eat food from your own garden and labor. Also, there are no preservatives, additives, or pesticides in the tomatoes. They're good for anybody. Just good, clean food. Enjoy good eating.